So, chapter one of Leadership, a Communication Perspective, is based on leadership and communication. So, the chapter starts off with pretty much describing what leadership is. It really brings up the point that leadership attracts universal attention, but then also that leadership has been studied for years and years. You can go back to famous historians, philosophers, and just pretty much any scientists of any sort have gone on and studied leadership for centuries. It then goes on to kind of describe what leadership is a little bit more. It goes on to tell you that leadership is pretty much essential to the human nature. Uh, it kind of describes if there's a society, there has to be some form of leadership to be successful, or just in general. Um, but it really hits on the fact that leadership is a very universal thing. It wants to make sure that you know that leadership is linked to what it actually means to be a human. So, one of the characteristics of leadership that it goes on to talk about is four four themes. The first theme of leadership is who you are. The second form was how you act. The third was leadership is about what you do. And then the fourth and final one was leadership is about how you work for others or work with others. Um, but the main definition that the text offered, that was kind of centered around communication for leadership, was that leadership is human, symbolic, which modifies the attitudes and behaviors of others in order to meet shared group goals and needs. It then goes on to talk about how most of those who study and write about leadership were focused more on the positive side of things. Recently, leadership has kind of had kind of a toxic connotation to it. Um, I don't know. There's been bad examples of past where, you know, leaders can really kind of screw up what someone else has built. It can be a bad CEO. It can be a bad president. Just either way. But in the grand scheme of things, it's much more than just that. Um, so it's important to focus on positive leaders instead of negative leaders, obviously, to really get the true contextual meaning of what a leader actually is. So it goes on to talk about how leaders and followers are kind of relational partners who play complementary roles based off of each other. Um, Good leaders exert a great degree of influence, and their followers want to follow them. So therefore, they carry on more responsibility for carrying out the work and making sure that it's done properly. Because without that mutual respect, it's not great. You're not going to be a great leader without the respect of your followers. You want to have them being respectful towards you, but then also making sure that you're holding them accountable to do a good job, and that's what makes a good leader. But then also that you're being accountable yourself, so that they have something to follow and know that they're following the right thing. So the chapter then goes on to talk about with shared leadership, responsibility for achieving shared goals is distributed throughout the group. So kind of it very goes hand in hand with as we were just mentioning about the complementary relationship between the followers and the actual leader. But the main thing that it kind of talks about was that leaders spend much of their time kind of shaping messages that are then presented to a variety of follower or stakeholder groups. But it's also true that more leadership responsibility you have, the more your job will actually focus on communication, and that's kind of what the whole chapter is about. How leadership and communication obviously relates. But yeah, so when it comes to viewing leadership through a communication perspective, you have to recognize that leadership depends on your willingness to interact with others. So, for instance, if you're just kind of a stick in the mud and just really not telling people what to do or interacting with them to any sort, you're not going to obtain the goal that you want. It's really important that you're willing to interact with them, but then also using skillful communication skills. You want to make sure that you have those down to a T. Some of the examples that the chapter went on to talk about was making use of storytelling, emotional communication competencies, and impression management. It then kind of goes on to discuss about how effective leaders kind of have uh, three types of stories that we kind of discussed just previously. You want to make sure that your stories include uh, that they spark action, they communicate who you are, they communicate the brand image to customers, they transmit organizational values, foster collaboration, tame the grapevine by pointing out the disconnect between rumors and reality, but then also share knowledge about problem solving and lead people into the future. Um, so then it then goes on to talk about how effective leaders know how to utilize their emotions, not just for themselves, but also with the relationships that they have with their followers. And the five emotional competencies that the textbook hit on was number one, perception, appraisal, and expression of emotion. Number two, attending to the emotions of others. Three, emotional facilitation of thinking. Four, understanding and analyzing emotional information and employing that information. And then finally, five, the regulation of emotion. So that pretty much summed up the chapter. It then went on to kind of talk about to achieve your goals, you'll really have to uh, manage the impressions that people have of you. If someone has a really bad image of you as a leader, odds are that they could either bad talk you, and that kind of filters onto the followers that you have, or just in general of like if you have a bad image of yourself, no one's going to want to follow that. So yeah, it's just really important to really kind of as a leader effectively use communication skills and to really leave a good impression and kind of communicate the right way.